Hello and welcome to a deep dive into the 1943 film The Seventh Victim. In today's video we're going to be delving into the dark and fascinating history behind this Hays Code horror, as well as breaking down and analysing its chilling lesbian subtext. If you're not familiar with The Seventh Victim, the film follows the character of Mary Gibson, who leaves her boarding school and heads to New York City in order to try and find her missing older sister Jacqueline. Aided by psychiatrists Dr. Lewis Judd and others during her search, Mary gets drawn deeper into the mystery, and evidence begins to point to the involvement of a sinister cult. So let's start with some interesting facts about the film. Firstly, the script for The Seventh Victim went through several rewrites and initially revolved around a murder mystery, with one earlier version of the script focused on an orphan caught in a murder plot amid California's Signal Hill oil wells. In this narrative, the heroine needed to solve the orphan's identity, saving him from becoming the seventh victim of the unknown killer. However, this version of the script ended up being rewritten entirely by DeWitt Bodine under the supervision of producer Val Lewton, with the new plot following a young woman who uncovers a cult of Satanists in Greenwich Village. The Seventh Victim was also set as a prequel of sorts to the 1942 supernatural horror film Cat People, also written by Bodine, about a Serbian woman who believes she's descended from a race of people who transform into predatory cats when passionately aroused. Connections between the two films include the actor Tom Conway, who stars as psychiatrist Dr. Lewis Judd in Cat People, and reprised that same role for The Seventh Victim. As a side note here, and spoiler alert, Dr. Judd's character dies in Cat People, which is why The Seventh Victim is set as a prequel and not a sequel. And in the last scene of The Seventh Victim, the character of Mimi, played by Elizabeth Russell, who, same as Tom Conway, also starred in both Cat People and The Seventh Victim, is dressed in the same way as her character in Cat People, the Catwoman at the Belgrade. Both films also contain John Donne quotes, a theme of satanic worship, and doomed women clad in black. You can also spot a couple of nods to cats throughout The Seventh Victim, which is fun. Interestingly, DeWitt Bodine based his idea for The Seventh Victim on his personal experiences in New York, where he encountered a real satanic society, and the Italian restaurant in the film, the Dante, was based on Barbetta, a restaurant in Manhattan's theatre district. Alongside this, Jacqueline's cosmetics business, La Sagesse, was inspired by Bodine's previous work as a journalist, reporting on cosmetic companies. According to research, it is thought that Val Lewton anonymously wrote and published an erotic novel called Grushenka 3 Times a Woman in 1933, and the book follows the story of a Russian serf girl compiled from contemporary documents in the Russian police files and private archives of Russian libraries. The work also contains themes of prostitution and sadism, which would have landed Lewton with criminal penalties if he had been exposed as the author at the time. And notably, these themes also appear in The Seventh Victim, with the character of Mimi being a sex worker and the Pillardists being a satanic cult. Interestingly, Val Lewton was actually born Vladimir Ivan Levington in 1904 in the Russian port city of Yalta on the Crimea, and his family first moved to Berlin and then on to the US to be close to his widowed mother's sister, the silent screen actress Alar Nazimova. And it was Nazimova who opened up the door for both Lewton and his mother in Hollywood. Alar Nazimova will be a familiar name to some of my viewers because we have spoken about her before on this channel. And for those who don't know, she was an openly bisexual actor, director, producer and screenwriter who at one point in her career was the highest paid film actress in the world, and also the first woman to start her own production company called Nazimova Productions. She also owned a lesbian bar named Mary's and coined the term sewing circle, which was a term used to describe the underground community of lesbian and bisexual women who would meet up during Hollywood's golden age, often at Nazimova's home, which attaches an interesting sapphic thread to The Seventh Victim through Val Lewton. The Seventh Victim was a first for both actress Kim Hunter, with Mary Gibson being her first ever screen role, and for director Mark Robson, who made his directing debut with it. And interestingly, in an interview, Robson spoke about the film's ominous and atmospheric nature. He said, "I think the actors and the director had to believe very strongly in the possibilities of disaster, that something was there. We believed it ourselves. We talked ourselves into believing it. The filming for The Seventh Victim took place over just 24 days, and despite being set in Greenwich Village, New York, it was filmed entirely on sets in Los Angeles. The Seventh Victim is also thought to be a key influence for the 1968 film Rosemary's Baby, as both films contain strong parallels, with there being psychological horrors that feature portrayals of evil lurking behind a sophisticated veneer and secret satanic cults operating within New York. The shower scene in The Seventh Victim is also thought to have been one of the inspirations for the iconic shower scene in the 1960 film Psycho, since both scenes contain visual parallels with the threatening figure appearing behind the curtain. The large painting in Dante's restaurant in The Seventh Victim is an adaptation of Henry Holliday's 1883 canvas of Dante Alighieri meeting his muse Beatrice on the streets of Florence, which contains parallels to Mary and Jason's characters in the film, with Jason refinding his creative inspiration through Mary, and the restaurant being the place where he very first sees her. Also, as Mary is leaving Highcliffe Academy to search for Jacqueline, she overhears a French class conjugating the verb chercher, which in English means to look for, which of course is a nice touch to the moment in the film where Mary is setting off to search for her sister. And lastly, it was later revealed by Luton's son in an interview that Mark Robson and editor John Lockhart had removed 4 substantial scenes from the final cut of the film, including an extended conclusion. And this happened as a result of needing to conform to B-movie runtimes, and reportedly also due to some audience members walking out of the film before the last scene during early screen tests. As mentioned earlier, The Seventh Victim was produced under the strict guidelines of the Hays Code, and I'm sure most of you are already aware of what the Hays Code is, but for those who don't know, it was a set of industry guidelines for the self-censorship of content that was applied to most motion pictures released by major studios in the United States from 1934 to 1968. The official name for the code was the Motion Picture Production Code, but it is more commonly known as the Hays Code because of Will H. Hays, who was president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America from 1922 to 1945. Now, the guidelines for the code were incredibly strict, and in relation to homosexuality, the guide states that sex perversion, or any inference of it, is forbidden. And just to note here, sex perversion was what homosexuality was referred to as back then, and this guideline effectively erased any direct mention or depiction of homosexuality from American movie productions during this period. This resulted in film creators utilizing subtext and implication in order to work around the guidelines. However, even still, any perceived implications of homosexuality had to be attached to negative associations and morally corrupt characters in order to align with and promote the Christian viewpoints and beliefs that the Hays Code was based upon, and for it to be permitted by the powers that be. And this is why homosexual subtext was the most overt in the horror genre during this period. Yes, we don't allow depictions of homosexuality, but you may hint at it as long as those hints make it clear that it's evil. In the 1940s, homosexuality was also considered a mental illness, and the Statistical Manual for the Use of Hospitals of Mental Disease, which was the predecessor of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, included a condition called constitutional psychopathic inferiority, in brackets without psychosis, that was described as a large group of pathological personalities, including sexual perversions, which, as mentioned, is what homosexuality was referred to as. During the late 1940s, Congress passed a law for the treatment of sexual psychopaths in Washington, D.C., which facilitated the arrest and punishment of individuals acting on same-sex desire, and it also marked the beginning of the Lavender Scare, which resulted in thousands of gay employees being fired or forced to resign from the federal workplace because of their sexuality. So all of this gives you an idea of the perceptions and hostile climate around homosexuality within the 1940s, and a lot of that is relevant to and reflected in The Seventh Victim, which brings us on to the next section of the video, the breakdown and analysis of the lesbian subtext and coding in the film. film. So the first thing we're going to look at in the film is the relationship between the characters of Jacqueline Gibson and Frances Fallon. Now, the first clue that suggests that there's something unique about their relationship is the way that Frances speaks of Jacqueline. For example, when Frances first sees Mary, she asks how Mary is, and before Mary can answer, Frances immediately and quite intently asks about Jacqueline. And Frances's body language here suggests a vested interest in Jacqueline that goes beyond casual friendly curiosity. Frances then tells Mary in reference to Jacqueline that anybody who ever sees her never forgets her. And later on in the film, whilst Mary is having her hair done by Frances, which, as a side note, it's interesting that Frances is a hairdresser given the associations between scissors and lesbianism. Although, considering the time period that this film was made, it's almost certainly just a coincidence, or who knows, perhaps it was a visionary inside joke ahead of its time. But anyway, Frances mentions how there's only one Miss Jacqueline, and both of these lines of dialogue, whilst seemingly of little significance on the surface, single Jacqueline out as someone who is unique to and admired by Frances, because Frances's descriptions of Jacqueline are reflective and revealing of her own perceptions and feelings for her. She has never forgotten Jacqueline since she first saw her, and Jacqueline is one of a kind to her. So this tells us that Jacqueline stands out against everyone else for Frances. There's also an air of wistfulness and awe in Frances's words, which is akin to somebody talking about their love interest, or a fan talking about a celebrity. And this reveals a lot about their dynamic and what Jacqueline means to Frances. The second clue is Frances's reaction to learning that Jacqueline is to be killed. She pleads for Jacqueline's life, desperately tries to defend her, and she is completely distraught, much more so than anybody else in the film. And in response to Frances's breakdown, a member of the cult says to her in reference to Jacqueline, "I know you love her." And this confirms what the earlier dialogue we discussed suggested, in that Frances places a lot of emotional value on Jacqueline. And again, it's worth noting that Frances is the only character in the film showing that level of emotion over Jacqueline. And the almost hysterical reaction she has is purposeful in trying to convey the depth of meaning that Jacqueline has to Frances compared to other people. And this unique connection is also portrayed through direction and mise-en-scène. For example, there's one scene where the cult are all looking ahead at Jacqueline and Frances is the only one bowing her head. This again suggests that there is something different and special about her connection to Jacqueline compared to everyone else. And it also portrays the depths of her devastation at the thought of losing Jacqueline. The third clue is that Jacqueline repeatedly refuses to drink the poison placed before her by the cult. No matter how they try and wear her down, she is obstinate about dying by her own hand and her own hand alone. But when Frances asks Jacqueline to drink the poison, we see a visible change come over Jacqueline. There's a moment of recognition and consideration before she reaches out to comply with Frances's request. And the weight behind what Frances is asking, for Jacqueline to take her own life by drinking the poison, and for Jacqueline to be prepared to do this for Frances, despite making a point of wanting to die by her own accord, is incredibly telling of the depth of their connection, which again underscores that there is something special and unique about their relationship. The fourth clue is as Jacqueline is about to drink the poison at Frances's request, Frances knocks it out of her hand, breaks down and starts weeping upon her lap as she says, "Being with you is the only time I was ever happy." And then, in a more muffled tone, "You've always been so good to me." This is a rather explicit admission of feelings, which confirms the earlier implications that Jacqueline is a person of unique emotional significance to Frances. And it explains why the depth of her feelings are so strong. Her happiness is tied directly to Jacqueline, and all of this seems very intense. In fact, it's Romeo and Juliet-esque for just a good historian-approved friendship. So the film consistently uses dialogue, mise-en-scène, and implication to portray an intense, unique, and special connection between Jacqueline and Francis. And when we break it down, it certainly creates a picture that contains unmistakable romantic suggestion and undertones. The next point of interest is at the cult gathering, a character named Gladys approaches Mary and tells her that she was intimate with Jacqueline, implying that they used to have a grand old time together. And then Gladys mentions that she supposes Jacqueline never told Mary about any of this since she was too young. Now, it's not the most significant dialogue in terms of lesbian subtext, but it does highlight that Jacqueline had this whole other life that was hidden from her sister. In fact, at one point in the film, Mary states that she feels like she never knew Jacqueline at all. And this double life aspect of Jacqueline's character contains parallels to homosexuality, with lesbians often hiding parts of themselves, their lovers, and their lives from everyone else due to the hostility and consequences they would face from being transparent. I think in part the reason the film got away with a slightly bolder flavour of lesbian subtext is that firstly, Jacqueline and Francis's characters and relationship are associated with evil and tragedy, which both reinforces negative associations around any homosexual implications and aligns with Christian Hays Code viewpoints. And secondly, in text, both women are tied to men and in heterosexual relationships, with Frances mentioning a boyfriend taking her to the Dante and Jacqueline having a husband, providing a heteronormative veneer. However, ironically, this actually adds to the lesbian subtext, particularly in the case of Jacqueline, since all of the desire and love in her marriage is portrayed as being one-sided on the part of her husband Gregory. It's not clear why Gregory and Jacqueline got married in the first place, but historically it has been well documented that lesbian women would sometimes end up married to men because of finances, opportunity, reputation, or heteronormative pressures. In fact, the same can even be said for straight women. So Jacqueline's marriage to a man is not necessarily proof of heterosexuality. And Gregory's speech about Jacqueline reveals that, to him, she's an exciting figure who is out of reach, and that's a lot of why he's attracted to her. They're married, but she's not his. And Gregory's speech about his attraction to the unattainable, complete with romantic music playing in the background, very much reflects both the one-sided aspect of their marriage and echoes the male fetishism and fascination with lesbianism, especially when it involves women who are deemed conventionally attractive. And it's notable that Gregory doesn't take Jacqueline's lack of feelings and desire for him into consideration at any point. It's all about what he wants. Furthermore, Gregory divulges to Mary that he helped Jacqueline rent a room above the Dante. And it's interesting, he says, people who commit suicide don't talk about it, and then that room made her happy in some strange way I couldn't understand. Because firstly, this exposes a level of ignorance, disconnection, and misunderstanding towards his wife, since we know Jacqueline both talks of suicide and goes through with it. Again, this ties back to the notion of Gregory not taking Jacqueline's feelings seriously or truly knowing who she is. And secondly, the room being the thing that makes Jacqueline happy, when it represents isolation and a respite from both society and her husband, is significant because it reveals a lot about her relationship with these two things, namely that she wants nothing to do with them. And alongside this, there's also a moment in the film where Mary leaves Jacqueline, and before she goes, Jacqueline assures her that she won't be lonely. But as soon as Mary is gone, Jacqueline's smile fades and she looks forlorn, implying that her words were a lie to comfort Mary. And the implication that Jacqueline, a young, beautiful married woman, surrounded by people who care for her, is lonely, is explained by the lesbian-coded aspect of her character, especially due to the alienation, persecution, and lack of community and authentic connection that lesbians experienced during that time period. And all of this adds further weight to the lesbian subtext in the film. And whilst Jacqueline's disinterest in her husband is not evidence of her being a lesbian, it aligns with the behaviour of a lesbian and contributes to the lesbian subtext. In fact, throughout the film, Jacqueline really doesn't pay any attention to her husband at all. She actively avoids him when she can and doesn't comply with any of his requests to see her. So So the film is very clear about the fact that Jacqueline has no romantic interest in her husband or seemingly any other man, and while she is in a mental health crisis and generally out of sorts, which explains some of her distant behaviour towards Gregory, when Francis asks something of her, namely that she take her own life, Jacqueline acknowledges Francis and complies, which again highlights the meaningfulness of her connection to Francis, especially in comparison to her husband. Another interesting aspect in relation to the film's lesbian subtext is the fact that it's set in Greenwich Village, New York, because Greenwich Village was a well-known haven for gay and lesbian culture and community during the 1940s, with numerous gay bars appearing in the area at that time. In fact, it's exactly where the Stonewall riots took place in 1969. It's also worth noting the theatre that appears in one scene near the end of the film, from which we see actors pouring out of and drawing Jacqueline into their midst, because the theatre, much like Greenwich Village, had and has strong associations with gay and lesbian culture and community, and the actors drawing Jacqueline in as one of their own could be symbolic of the fact that she is of that culture and community. It could also of course be related to other themes in the film, such as artistic creation or madness, and of course Bodine took inspiration from Manhattan's theatre district for the film as well, but regardless, it's worth highlighting the gay associations. We also see Jacqueline is consistently dressed in black throughout the film, which of course is symbolic of her associations with evil, death and darkness, and when we compare this to Mary's lighter appearance, it's literally night and day. Unlike Jacqueline, Mary is recognisably good or conforming through her appearance, and what's interesting about this is Mary and Jacqueline's appearances represent the associations around their respective characterizations as women. For example, with Jacqueline, you have a female character who is unavailable to men, lesbian coded, and framed as a disturbed, tragic individual who ends up being punished with death. And she's marked as other or deviant through being cloaked in a colour with negative associations. And then you have Mary, a female character who is romantically receptive to men, good with children, in other words maternal, and who is portrayed of being of sound character and appearance-wise is presented in a way which is recognisably conforming and has safe and good connotations. And so through this, the film reinforces positive associations around patriarchal ideals of women and negative ones around those who reject heteronormativity and conformity. Next, we're going to look at the associations between lesbianism and mental illness in the film, which, as we've already discussed, reflects the belief that homosexuality was synonymous with poor mental health during the 1940s. Firstly, for the most part of the film, our lesbian-coded character Jacqueline appears distracted, unwell, and out of sorts. She is also heavily associated with and looked after by a psychiatrist. And within the context of that time period, this visible display of poor mental health connects to and enhances the lesbian-coded aspect of her character, due to the associations between the two. As discussed, Jacqueline is also described as being made happy by having a room of her own, and this can be connected to the poor mental health aspects of her character, since isolating oneself can be a symptom of numerous mental health conditions, but her physical isolation is also representative of the figurative isolation she experiences as an other in society, and this contains obvious parallels to homosexual experience, where lesbians are alienated and often prefer to live separate from a hostile homophobic society for either safety reasons or to protect their own mental health. There's also a much darker interpretation of Jacqueline's relationship to the room above the Dante, since the room symbolizes death, and Jacqueline being happy when she's in that room with death aligns with the existentially troubled aspect of her character, but it also, interestingly, within the context of the lesbian-coded aspect of her character, contains messaging about finding death preferential over living within an oppressive homophobic society that's driving her to insanity. It also connects to and reflects the higher risk of suicidal ideation and suicide in homosexuals in real life, particularly historically. Interestingly, there's also a parallel between Jacqueline being physically absent throughout a lot of the film, and the erasure of homosexuality within the media in that period. And in relation to this, homosexuality was largely an unspoken topic in 1940s America, and the fear of the unspoken and unknown around homosexuality complements the fear around the general unspoken and unknown in the film. Jacqueline's character is also heavily involved with a satanic cult, which again, within a Christian context, reflects the associations between homosexuality and evil. And as previously mentioned, this aligns with the Christian essence of the Hays Code and connects to the theme of Christianity in the film. Now, what's interesting is that Satanism represents the countercultural personal liberty and is a rejection of Abrahamic dogma, all of which contains parallels with homosexuality. So Jacqueline and Francis being drawn to the Palladists and associated with a satanic cult, offering a freedom from the oppressive restraints of Christianity, adds further weight to the lesbian coded aspect of their characters. There's also a moment in the film where Francis and Mrs. Reedy are talking about the Palladius symbol, and Mrs. Reedy is scolding Francis for revealing information about it, and she says that symbol is us. And this idea of us within the film is interesting because the satanic, free-thinking, non-conforming, homosexual coded, mentally ill members of the cult included in that us represents the other in society. And through this, the film creates a contrast between the evil societal other and the good righteous Christian. And this is especially prevalent in the scene where we see the good righteous Christian characters preaching and reciting the Lord's Prayer to the evil societal others in an attempt to shame them and bring them back under religious order, which, as a side note, is a stark example of the Christian propaganda that was being projected onto audiences during this time as a result of the Hays Code. However, despite all of the negative associations attached to Jacqueline's character, interestingly, she is more portrayed as a victim of the satanic cult rather than a driving force within it. She joins the Palladists because she feels lost, unhappy, and disconnected from society. She isn't portrayed as someone who is calculating or who takes joy in being evil. And this is significant because it creates a layer of sympathy for a lesbian-coded character, instead of the usual black and white villainization that's signature to homosexual-coded characters in early Hays Code cinema. And even though Jacqueline's story ends with suicide, her character's death feels tragic rather than justified. And furthermore, the other lesbian-coded character in the film, Frances, is also portrayed as unique from the other cult members in that she shows emotion and a conscience about murder, or at least about Jacqueline's murder, which humanizes her and again creates this layer of relatability and sympathy for her character. And a lesbian-coded character having any sympathetic qualities or being portrayed in a sympathetic light instead of being purely demonized was radical within American cinema during the 1940s, and it's one of the many aspects of the film which make it such a unique production. Moving on from the lesbian subtext, I wanted to also discuss the prominent themes of nihilism and death in the film, both of which are signature to Val Lewton's work, with Death is Good being a statement made by him to describe the message of his horror films. Now, firstly, The Seventh Victim was produced during World War II, which was a grim period of history where death was very much in the public consciousness. And Val Lewton has spoken about the darker influences on his work stemming from his personal life. And both of these things undoubtedly shape the themes of death and nihilism in the film. However, death is primarily explored through an existential and psychological lens, through the character of Jacqueline, who is seeking death out as a solace from her existential dread and despair. And this, as discussed, connects to the poor mental health and lesbian-coded aspects of her character. But interestingly, Jacqueline's relationship with death also contains commentary about agency, because in the film, Jacqueline makes it clear that she wants to die, but only on her own terms. And there's a feminist interpretation of this, with Jacqueline exercising control over her life and body in one of the few ways, or perhaps the only way she could, during a period where women had very little autonomy and choice. And there's also an existential interpretation of this, with suicide being an extreme expression of general human agency agency and free will. Furthermore, you could connect this idea of agency and choice back to the lesbian subtext, in that homosexuals also had very little freedom to exist authentically during that period. And with Jacqueline being trapped in a loveless marriage and an oppressive society, her existence is the one thing she has total control over. And so Jacqueline exercising that control can be seen as an extreme act of resistance against conformity, or a way of reclaiming her freedom from a heteronormative society in the only way she can. It's also worth noting that Frances, the only other lesbian-coded character in the film, was the one person Jacqueline was willing to give up her agency over life for, which threads into this interpretation. And all of these interpretations frame death as a source of freedom from despair, oppression, and so on in the film. Furthermore, Jacqueline seeking out and yearning for death also contains a parallel to seeking out and yearning for the same sex, in that both suicide and homosexuality are taboo and both considered sins by the church. The seventh victim also opens and ends on a sonnet, "Thou hast made me, and shall thy work decay," by the poet John Donne, which examines religious devotion and doubt. And there's a theme of sin and needing God's help to resist sinful temptations in the poem, which align with Jacqueline seeking out the satanic cult and the lesbian-coded aspects of her character in the film. Notably, Donne also wrote a book called By Thanatos, which contained a defense of suicide. And this connection between Donne and a defense of suicide connects to the implications and messaging around death in The Seventh Victim, with it being framed as a solace and a welcome relief from life. Interestingly, in a final scene that was cut from the film, after Jacqueline's suicide, Mary, Gregory and Jason meet at the Dante restaurant, and Gregory and Mary go off together, leaving Jason standing before the restaurant's mural of Dante and Beatrice, which, as we discussed earlier, is symbolic of his relationship with Mary. And at this point, Jason then says to himself, "I am alive. Yet every hope I had is dead. Death can be good. Death can be happy. If I could speak like Cyrano, then perhaps you might understand." And this very much emphasizes this repeated notion of death being a solace and a positive in the film. And as a side note, it's notable that this romanticization of death and suicide goes against the general principles of the Hays Code, which may possibly explain why that final scene was cut. The whole death is good thing is a little on the nose. However, similar to the lesbian subtext, the fact that this film is a horror film and that the romanticization of death is primarily associated with the satanic mentally ill character likely explains why it was permitted by the powers that be. So death really sits at the heart of The Seventh Victim, and there's a prominent and consistent reminder of it throughout the film. For example, you have the imagery of the noose in room number 7 and the morgue, both of which are foreshadowing of Jacqueline's death. You have the chiming and ringing of bells, which has associations with passing and death. And in relation to this, you have the consistent clock imagery, which of course is symbolic of mortality and inevitability of death. And you also have the John Donne poetry, which we've already discussed. There's also a scene in the film where a part of the poem, The Chambered Nautilus by Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., is being recited as Mary leaves the school. And this poem contains a theme of death and spiritual ascendance, which is relevant to the theme of death in the film. But interestingly, this poem is also primarily interpreted as being metaphorical of self-growth, and is about abandoning the past and moving on to higher things, which aligns with Mary's arc. There's also a scene towards the end of the film where Mary's students are reciting the Old English nursery rhyme, Oranges and Lemons. Now, there are different versions of this rhyme dating back to 1744, and it was likely in circulation even before then. What's interesting about this is it's thought that the events in the version of the rhyme that we hear in The Seventh Victim are about the executions at Newgate Prison, which once stood on the current site of the Old Bailey next to St. Sepulchre's Church. Hence the bells of Old Bailey in the rhyme, and prisoners here would receive a visit the night before their hangings by the bellman of St. Sepulchre, who would hold a candle in one hand and ring the execution bell in the other. And this not only connects to Jacqueline's suicide method, but when the children are reciting the rhyme, Mary receives a phone call, in other words, the bell rings, the night before Jacqueline's death. And whether purposeful or coincidental, I thought this was a really cool connection. Furthermore, in a lot of ways, Jacqueline is this ghost-like figure who consistently haunts the narrative. She's absent throughout most of the film, yet she's always being referred to in dialogue, and the actions of the other characters primarily revolve around her. And this haunting and ghost-like aspect of her character is both foreshadowing of her death and complements the themes of death in the film. Another prominent theme in The Seventh Victim is the number 7, and it connects to both the death and Christian elements of the film. Firstly, Jacqueline lives in room number 7, above the restaurant The Dante, and the name Dante connects to Dante Alighieri, who famously wrote a work called The Divine Comedy. And this is relevant because The Divine Comedy details the 9 circles of hell, and the 7th circle of hell, called the Hell of the Violent and Bestial, includes 3 rounds of sins of violence: the violence against neighbours, the violence against the self, and the violence against God, nature and art, with violence against the self connecting to Jacqueline's character and suicide. The number 7 also relates to the film's title and Jacqueline being the 7th victim of the satanic cult. And as mentioned earlier, the film opens on a John Donne sonnet and closes with those same lines being recited, creating a complete circle which relates to the number 7 within a Christian context. Since the number 7 represents completion of creation, with God creating and finishing the earth in 7 days. It also relates to the 7 deadly sins, with sin being a prominent theme throughout the film, especially for Jacqueline's character. The character of Mimi, who is dying, lives next door to Jacqueline in room number 8. And this is significant because both Mimi and Jacqueline are characters haunted by impending death. They are both on timers for different reasons, but where Jacqueline succumbs to death and her story ends, Mimi reignites her passion for life and rises up despite her circumstances for one last time. Her story looked as though it was over, but it's not. And in a Christian context, the number 8 symbolizes resurrection, new beginnings, and spiritual rebirth, with key biblical events, such as Jesus' resurrection happening on the 8th day, being a prime example of this. So, Mimi figuratively rising out of her grave, with a newfound appreciation and passion for life, even if it's only for one night, parallels and connects to this. Also, as a side note here, Mimi, who is a dying prostitute, was actually intended to be a dark joke in reference to the opera La Bohème, which features a dying woman named Mimi. Mimi is also an interesting figure in that her last-minute burst of optimism and passion highlights the extent of Jacqueline's nihilism and despair. Where Mimi sees death as a reason and an opportunity for embracing life, Jacqueline perceives it as a reason for and an opportunity to get away from life. And in a lot of ways, this can be interpreted as to how Jacqueline is spiritually and figuratively dead, which leads to her actual death by the end of the film, whereas Mimi, figuratively and spiritually, still has life within her, which connects to her still being alive by the end of the film. And in a lot of ways, this end scene encapsulates what the core of this film revolves around, which is deep-rooted existential despair. However, this film is incredibly layered, and its meaning and messaging is ultimately up to the interpretation of the viewer. All in all, The Seventh Victim is an endlessly intriguing and influential piece of horror noir cinema, and its unique and layered lesbian subtext is one of the many aspects of the film that makes it so fascinating to deconstruct. Now, if you've seen The Seventh Victim, be sure to let me know your own thoughts and observations about it down in the comments section below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for instant disappointment and possibly cheap thrills. And I'll see you lost souls soon. Goodbye!